I will be on a little bit of a soapbox for today, a little bit of preachiness, but as Mitch introduced my background, I have a master's in tropical marine ecosystem management. It's a mouthful there. I've spent quite a lot of my early career working in nonprofit conservation, both in the field and as sort of a data analyst, doing large-scale studies funded by NOAA in order to determine differences between coral genotype and site preferences. So I've got a lot of experience sort of both in the field and also analyzing that data. And I've seen the sort of firsthand the direct effects that climate change happens. I was working in the Keys for those 6 years, and even across that small time period, we saw measurable, significant decline in habitat, environment, and coral coverage, despite all the work that we were doing. A little bit of a lost cause. Feels like putting a Band-Aid on an arterial wound. It's kind of how it felt to a lot of us. One of the big reasons I made the shift out of that was kind of for that big reasoning. Essentially feel-good work that wasn't really accomplishing ultimate goals, wasn't actually moving the needle forward on sustainability anywhere. So this is a very important issue for myself. Again, I'm gonna get a little bit up on a soapbox today, but I argue that this should be an important issue for everyone. The tech field in specific, but also just for everyone in general. This affects all of our lives, as I'll highlight here sort of in the beginning. It is a global priority. It should be a global priority. Argue it's not. So I'll dive a little bit into just the effects, the problem, the impacts, and then talk a little bit about the tech field, in particular, generative AI, and these large-scale companies training LLMs, and how I think and I feel like there needs to be more focus on how we can do that in a much more sustainable manner, both in terms of energy, in terms of water usage, and just in terms of general infrastructure and thought. So jumping through a quick agenda here, we'll talk about the problem, its impact, something called the tragedy of the commons, if you've never heard of that before. We'll talk about this concept of greenwashing, which again is something that this idea of companies seeing that customers and consumers and the public are demanding for sustainability, but they're not being honest about it, they're not being 100% into it, they're not really giving it their all. A little bit too little too late, as I'll talk about in a little bit. We'll then talk about actual drive for AGI, some statistics here. Very, very basic. Again, this is not technical presentation, but driving into specific companies who are actually walking backwards on their sustainability goals in the last couple of years because of increased production in data centers and model training. And then finally, I'll end hopefully with a little bit of hope. I don't want this to be totally doom and gloom. What can we do? What should we be doing? What can we be advocating for with politicians, with companies, et cetera, regulations? And so just talk a little bit also about something called intensification, where I actually myself, being in this intersection between conservation and technology, have faith that we as a species, as a planet, will be able to invent ourselves beyond these problems, hopefully, things like carbon capture. So we'll jump into a little bit of that. So this is a global problem. This is a scientific fact at this point. 2023 was the hottest year on record since 1985, or 1950 rather. This decade, 2013 to 2024, contains all 10 of the warmest years in record. If that doesn't raise your eyebrows, it should. The rate of warming has actually been increasing for the last 30 years, since essentially pre-industrial times, at a somewhat exponential rate. This is going to get worse if things don't change. This is set to continue. It's been about 46 years since we've seen a colder than average year. Again, pretty eye-opening, pretty telling that warming is happening and it is a global problem. Of course, this here is global surface temperature. It's a lot more complicated than this. It's a very simplified view of this issue. When we talk about sea surface temperatures, there's a problem suited there. When we talk about land temperatures, meltwater, ice water melting, glaciers, et cetera. But this is the best representation that there's a problem, and it is a global problem. There's been future warming projections, essentially predictions, models. ICCP, the International Panel for Climate Change, has what are called representative concentration pathways, or RCPs. Different scenarios containing different levels of emissions, us reducing emissions by a certain amount of, essentially carbon that we're then putting into the atmosphere on, and have done projections, and not surprisingly, we're still going to be warming. even if we reduce emissions to a certain extent, we fall into things like negative feedback loops, where our glacial ice is already melting, it's exposing more land, that's releasing more greenhouse gas. That's a process that's now already in place. That's a physical, biological, geological process, and nothing we do to stop emissions is going to stop that. We need to think of another technology, things like carbon capture, that could maybe alleviate that negative feedback loop. The global impact here, lots of different things. Talk about a couple sections: ecological, meteorological, and economic. In terms of ecological, we've already seen a massive reduction in biodiversity and abundance. A report recently this year from the World Wildlife Foundation has this number sitting about 74% now. This figure is from a couple of years ago, in fact. It's sitting about 69% reduction in global abundance. Now, right, what does this mean, right? Why is this important? I would argue that there's an intrinsic reason there, right? Just intrinsic beauty, intrinsic responsibility as stewards of our planet, but there's also economic factors here. Loss of key habitats like coral reefs lead to loss in fisheries for coastal communities, lead to loss in tourism industry, recreational fishing, scuba diving, snorkeling, whatever it might be. These have tangible effects on societies, on organizations, and on our economy. This involves, or also includes, meteorological events, extreme weather events, global pattern shifts. We've seen areas becoming more deserts. We have seen deserts actually recovering. Right? There's always a give and take. Specifically within the Florida Keys, again, near and dear to me, but we've seen that reef shift from a coral reef landscape to an algae-dominated landscape. That has a very different connotation for the species that live there. Again, this idea of, those coastal communities have relied upon that reef for a very long time to provide food, to provide business, to provide shelter from storm events, and we're losing that. This is happening across the world. One big thing is we're losing arable land, farmable land that we can grow food on, and that is a primary essential resource for humans, as well as every other animal organism. We're losing little space for access to fresh water. It's already an issue in third world countries. It's going to be an issue here. Getting back to my next slide, tragedy of commons, think about Nestle. And they're in big litigation on what water they can use. And is that public access, is it not? Should they be taking that water for privatization? And so this idea of meteorological impacts will affect everything from the planet and the species in our habitat, but also has a huge economic effect. Another prime example here is Florida and insurance companies. Major housing insurance companies have pulled out of Florida because their analysts have run the numbers, and it is not a sustainable business for them. Using sustainable in a very different context there. It's not affordable. They are going to lose money if they keep paying insurance policies out to people whose houses are affected by floods or hurricanes. This year is a prime example. This leads to Florida having their own government insurance organization, which is denying claims as we speak to people victims of the last two hurricanes, because there's no money. Literally, they can't do it. I think that's a pretty clear. Someone's run the numbers from a business standpoint and have decided it's not sustainable, which means it's not sustainable from a planet ecosystem standpoint. That's where those numbers are coming from. The other big thing, and this is something I'll just gloss on, it's a very touchy subject, it gets very political, is refugees, migrants, climate refugees, literal space. Again, getting to access to land, access to fresh water. We already have a huge influx of refugees and migrants across the world, whether it's because of climate, whether it's because of geopoliticalness, whether it's because of conflict, right? This is a huge, huge issue. I don't have the answer to it, I don't claim to. But this is only going to become more and more of a problem. Let's go forward. So this gets me to the idea of the tragedy of the commons, if you've never heard of this before. And it dates all the way back to Aristotle, actually. Made popular by an economist in 1833, William Foster Lloyd, and then sort of came into the scene, the limelight, by Garrett Hardin, an ecologist in 1968, published a paper called The Tragedy of the Commons. And it was more of a sort of philosophical argument than ecological, a little bit more economic as well. He was focused a lot more on this idea of overpopulation and carrying capacity of our planet. Can we actually support the number of people we have in terms of food and water? Again, access to those resources. But really the idea of the tragedy of the commons is privatizing the use of common resources and socializing the risk, the loss of those resources. Again, think about a company like Nestle taking public water, using that for private profit. This is going to connect to this idea of data centers, taking your data, but also utilizing water and energy resources. This goes beyond the commons, it goes beyond sustainability, but this idea that because a resource is common use, right? Land, water, air, think about air quality, this is a big issue that comes up here. Water quality, obviously. How do you regulate that, right? How do you control how people access that, whether it's government or organizations collaborating with each other? But the tragedy is that we as humans, right, are gonna prioritize the short term over the long term. It's inherently selfish, but that's what we are, and we have to recognize that. The common example, and this is William Foster Lloyd in 1833, talked about sheep grazing on a pasture, where that pasture isn't owned by anyone necessarily. And if they have multiple people who are grazing multiple herds of sheep, a single individual is going to want to maximize their use of that common resource so that someone else doesn't get to it before them. That's not sustainable. That's basically the antithetical to sustainability. And it's something that we have to, as a species, as a globe, as a community, to try and do better, to try and get over that hump. So this idea of tragedy of the commons has been around for a very, very long time, and it's all about usage, right? Resource usage in the context that we're talking about here today. That brings me to greenwashing. This is very subjective sometimes. This is, not subjective, but this gets to regulation, it gets into some government, which is tricky always. But consumers have started to become more ecologically conscious. Hopefully, I think so. I don't have necessarily the data behind this, but there's been a shift towards seeing more sustainable products, services, foods, et cetera, whatever it might be, organic, all natural, that companies are being disingenuous about. They aren't putting their full attention towards it because that's not what the company is about, right? They're about profit, they're about making a business and sustaining that business. Right, again, that different definition of sustainability when we talk about an organization. This is just something to be cautious and aware of because it's happening in the tech field as well. And it's gonna happen more and more as we get into, again, this idea of increasing and upscaling data centers and AI training, using language that makes it seem like these companies are consciously, ecologically conscious. They're trying to be good citizens. We could talk all about companies as citizens, not the scope of this talk. Not at all the scope of this talk. I have lots of thoughts there, as you can imagine. But just being conscious as the consumer of different terms of is this company actually invested in sustainability? Are they actually invested in improving their processes, in reducing the energy uses of their processes, the water usage of their processes, the land usage, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll see a lot of terms here, a lot of quotes on screen, things like all natural, plant-based, dolphin safe. That has an actual government regulation that is never enforced because the people reporting that data are the fisheries themselves. Conflicts of interest all over the world. It's all over the marine science industry in particular. Who lives on the Fisheries Council? Members of those businesses. This is something that we need to recognize and hopefully change. One of the big things I'm going to advocate for at the end is voting. Vote with your money, vote politically, vote for the people, the organizations, the programs that you think are actually serious about this issue. The big one here I have in highlight, right, things like clean coal, eco-friendly, green initiatives, biodegradable, flushable wipes. Those do not degrade. Farm fresh, energy efficient. BP rebranding themselves as Beyond Petroleum, yet still probably about 70% invested in oil products. Blows my mind. Anything plastic, if you're not aware, is a petroleum product. Planned obsolescence, think about Apple maybe claiming their new iPhone is somehow sustainably produced, but they produce a new iPhone every year. That's waste that gets sent to a third world country where its metals and materials are broken down, let alone the mining that gets involved in there. I'm not preaching anything about Apple or anything in general. I have a Samsung phone, right? We all need to at this point. But just being aware of this. The big one I have here in red, carbon offset, is what's going to connect us to AGI. The big way a lot of these major companies who are training in upscaling data centers have sort of justified their usage and increased usage of energy is through carbon offset programs. They're paying to pollute. They're paying to emit gas. They're paying to use the common resource. Where that money goes, sometimes it's a good place, sometimes it's an organization, but it's not always clear. This is hesitant to call it disingenuous, but this is a problem, right? This idea of carbon offset. We can shove this problem to someone else. We can pay someone else to fix this problem. I would argue we are no longer in that capability. We are beyond that. We are sort of beyond a tipping point of return where that doesn't do justice to the problem. It doesn't do justice to what those companies are doing. Airline companies have huge carbon offset programs. Obviously, they're major polluters. Talk all about the travel industry, but private jets in particular. CEOs flying all over the world, looking at Elon Musk, among others. Jeff Bezos too. This idea of carbon offset is a lie. I'll come out and say that you're not offsetting any of the pollution you're producing, whether you're directly investing in something like carbon capture. I would call that something very different. Right? That's not carbon offset. That's you trying to improve your process. How can we produce more energy, right, without producing less emissions? Whether that's things like green sources of energy, wind, solar, or something like nuclear fusion. I know that personally, Sam Altman himself is invested in cold fusion technology. Whether that's a thing or not remains to be seen. It's been something that's been trying to come about for like 20, 30 years, but just an anecdotal example of, at least he's thinking about that, okay, we need to be focused on something different. So that leads us to this drive for AGI and sustainability. Data centers being upscaled. What's the cost of that? We don't know. There's a lack of a standard measurement in terms of emissions. They have sort of different types, different levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, of emissions that companies measure in sustainability reports, things like Google and Microsoft, but we need to know what's the cost of increasing, the scale of data centers and model training. And there isn't a great way to encompass that across all companies, what that means, for a country, but also for our planet. 2019, there was a study that estimated the carbon footprint for training sort of an average language model, NLP model, is about 125 round-trip flights from New York City to Beijing. Maybe in the grand scope of things, that doesn't seem like a lot, but when you think about the amount of models that are being trained and iterated upon, it quickly exponentially scales up. That's a lot of flights. That's a pretty long flight. It's a lot of carbon being produced. It also involves things like material infrastructure costs, and these are being thrown to counties, governments, these are being thrown to cities on how can we need to improve our grid because someone's coming in and forming a data center. That's money that taxpayers are paying for, or that's things that taxpayers' money are paying for. That is, it's jobs, but that construction contributes to pollution and climate change. The fact that we're ramping up, not ramping up, we are considering not decommissioning certain power plants or extending the life scale of certain power plants simply because we have a greater need for energy. Is a little mind-blowing. Again, it gets us this idea of privatizing the profits and socializing the risk. All of that infrastructure, all of that grid, all of that production and delivery are being thrown to the government to regulate. They're being thrown to city governments and states, if we're thinking just the US, to figure out how that works. Where I would argue it's the responsibility of the company to be involved in that process. I'm not saying they're not, but They need to be more involved. Goldman Sachs estimated that by 2030, about 8% of the total power in the country will be used by data centers alone. If you think about industry and you think about the amount of companies in our country that do business, that's an insane number, a huge number. And that's not even the business, that's just their data centers using power. That is an insane amount of money. There is no city that uses 8% of the total power in the country. My other side of here is this idea of sustainability goals, getting to greenwashing. Companies have jumped on board. We want to be sustainable by this projected target. We want to be net zero, carbon net zero emissions. By 2023, Google has made this commitment. Microsoft has made the commitment to be net negative by 2023. And these are just two anecdotal statistics, not singling these companies out. They're not the only ones doing this. Google claims they were carbon neutral in 2007 due to carbon offsets. Again, I would argue that that's a lie. But in the last year, their emissions, or last 4 years rather, their emissions are up 48%. These are their words. This is from their 2023 sustainability report. Their words, again, because of increasing need for data center infrastructure. And so they are actively, and they're not shying away from it, reneging on sustainability goals, walking ourselves backwards in order, for the goal of business, for the goal of data centers to stay ahead of the curve, to have the best LLM, right, have the best agent system, whatever it might be. Microsoft themselves, again, net negative by 2023. Emissions are up 29% since 2020. There is a lack of commitment to these sustainability goals that they can just keep pushing back. And if we aren't aware of that, we aren't very clear that they shouldn't be doing that, that's going to be a big problem. This quote here is from the Microsoft Sustainability 2023 report. Infrastructure and electricity needed for these technologies create new challenges for meeting sustainability commitments across the tech sector. My rebuttal to that statement would be, what are you doing to improve those technologies? And they're doing things, right? Absolutely. I'm not saying they aren't. I'm just saying they're not doing enough. So what do we do about it? This is a call to action. What do we do personally about it? Because it seems a little doom and gloom. Big thing are vote politically, especially if you're in the US, but across the world. Demand that regulations, particularly for things like generative AI, have conversations about sustainability, energy, and water usage. Demand that cities create better public transportation, right? Trying to eliminate our reliance on cars and fossil fuels. From demanding that your city implements a recycling program. Your voice matters, your vote counts. Sometimes it might not seem like it, but certainly very, very relevant in today's day and age, this year in particular. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I wouldn't dare do that. But vote for the people you think represent your interests. And I argue your interests should include our planet. Everyone's interests should include our planet. The other thing is technological. Again, this idea of intensification. It's a concept in anthropology where we have stayed ahead of this intensification curve via technology, whether that's the invention of agriculture, whether that's the invention of different irrigation methods, thinking all the way back, whether that is the invention of the Industrial Revolution, the steam engine, all the way to gas-powered engine. We have used technology to stay ahead of the carrying capacity of our planet. I'm thinking now into things like hydroponic farms. We don't need arable land if we have the technology to produce food in another manner. It all comes back to energy. We have that technology, but right now it's very energy intensive. So if we can solve that energy problem, investing in alternative sources, investing in things like nuclear power, and even beyond, we can attempt to try and invent ourselves past this problem. This again touches on things like carbon capture. Not offset, right, where you're just paying someone else to worry about it, but can we actually alleviate our emissions totally? The other big one is individually. I do a lot of things personally that are sustainable. I do a lot of things that aren't. Total hypocrite, I'm aware of that, absolutely. I flew on a plane to be here today. I got in an Uber that claimed it was eco-friendly, and it was not. It was a big SUV. Greenwashing, prime example of it. But reduce your own usage, your own waste. Advocate for your group, your friend group, your families to do the same. try to limit your impact, vote with your wallet, right? Do your research on the companies. If something is truly organic, buy local. I'm a big farmers market fan, that kind of thing. Not saying that's going to solve our problems at all, but I don't want y'all to leave here thinking about anything you do individually doesn't matter, because it does. It matters as a collective. It does help. If you're doing it, someone else might see you do it. And just awareness, right? Advocate for this as an issue across your group, your sphere, your influence. Advocate for it to be talked about. Advocate for it to be talked about in politics, in companies, and technology. So summary here, our climate's changing. It's going to impact you. That's a fact. Please don't deny it. Major companies have regressed on their sustainability goals in favor of upscaling data centers. This is not the whole picture, but just in terms of technology. And there's an attitude that it can be fixed later. Someone else is going to fix it, invoking these parallels to our tragedy of the commons, privatizing profits, socializing the risk. And that accountability here should be a key aspect we talk about when we talk about regulation and sustainability. We're beyond a tipping point here, and delaying this action, delaying these conversations are going to have unknown consequences. I can't tell you what they are because they're unknown. We don't know that. We can't see into the future. We don't know what happens when we lose the Atlantic Ocean current. There's more than one current, but right, that's something that scientists think might happen if we have a lot of fresh water coming in from the ices, but we have no idea the consequences there. Something we really can't model because it's never happened before, at least in our biological record. So, and finally, just want to shout out Bletchley. I just found out about this. I just added this in the last 10 minutes. 30 minutes now at this point. We are hosting a Sustainable Futures Mastery Quest coming up in the next month, I believe, mid-November. So if you are part of Bletchley's Discord, got a shout-out organization there, certainly jump in there just to spur that conversation and those talks. Again, it's all about getting involved, advocating, and making as many people as we can aware of this issue. That'll be all. So thank you, everyone, for listening, and I'll be here if you have questions. Any questions? Yeah.
I often wonder how much energy is wasted in the cloud for completely useless images and videos, not just dumb content. Mm-hmm. Literally, I'll take 15 pictures at a family op and then forget to go back and delete, all that stuff. Yeah. Nobody's ever going to look at it. And your research to be able to come across anything like that.
Yeah, so the question was about sort of just the massive content that's being stored in something like the cloud, whether it's pictures, whether it's video reels of my cat. I'm guilty of that. Dog, vacations, right? I'll go on a vacation and take 100 pictures and not use a single one of them. I don't directly sort of have any data there or involved in that research, but I think that is a definitely, it gets to this idea of like kind of consumerism, not necessarily as the major problem, but social media influence. Everyone wants to see that they're in Italy on a vacation. Everyone wants to see fancy pictures of that. There's something wrong with that, but it should trigger us to think about our personal usage there. I just got a note from Gmail that my account is 88% full because I don't delete emails. That's my failing. One of my failings there. I should probably go back because I don't need any of those. They're being someone's paying, right? Whether it's monetarily or environmentally or energy-wise, to store that data somewhere that I will never need. All the promotions from whatever company I signed up for last. So that's definitely a good point. Any other questions? I'll let y'all get to some lunch. Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, so the question was this idea of the comparison, what it costs to train that model, 125 flights from New York to Beijing, and then what's the one big thing that we could maybe change? This is gonna be kind of obvious, kind of cliche, but the dependency on fossil fuels. It is the major leading cause of this, not the only one. There's a much more complicated problem than that, but that's a big thing. not just cars, right? I'm not just talking cars and in that industry, but if you think shipping, consumerism, right? Major shipping industry, the fishing industry, in fact, global air travel, this all uses fossil fuel. And that's definitely one of the big issues we need to get past. We have the technology to get past that. It already exists. Solar power, wind power, hydrothermal power, hydraulic power, like wave, tidal energy. We have the technology, we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have the scale. And that's where I think companies should be, can be, and some are, focused on investments. And not just energy companies, right? I think these companies that are using the energy and responsible for it need to have that accountability as well. But that would be the big one, I say. Mm-hmm.
One of the issues is that oftentimes ancillary plants that can supply the grid are, actually often coal. And I guess the question really is sort of, do you have any feeling of what percentage of the source of kind of power is coming in as these models?
Yeah. That's a great question. It's about by percentages of where their power is coming from. If you get your power bill, it might even have a breakdown on it. Mine does. That is in their global reports. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but both the Google Sustainability Report, Microsoft, other companies as well have produced the same reports, whether it's through their ESG sections or policies or just as a company. And so they are doing things, right? I don't want to leave this thinking that they're not. These are not the enemy necessarily. I just argue it's not enough. So those numbers are out there. It's, again, the issue you got to is this idea of supplemental power. And this is like, I didn't mention in the presentation, but personally to me it feels a little bit like chicken before the egg, where we know we have these issues, we know we need more power, well, let's just spin up a decommissioned coal plant, or let's stop this one from being commissioned in 10 years as it was planned. Yeah, and that's, again, the chicken before the egg. Our government is saying, hey, okay, we need this power. Hey, okay, you need this now. Here's what we can do, and not, hey, you can't do this now. We need to think about this collectively, solve the power issue, and then we can move to, how many data centers you want. Everyone can have their own little nuclear fusion engine, whatever it might be. So yeah, definitely, and don't get into it, but trusting those numbers, you have to. Do I trust my power bill that tells me percentage of power coming from? Not really. I signed up for checked a box on my power company, and I'm going to believe what they tell me. Is that greenwashing? Maybe a little bit, but they're trying to do what they can. Yeah, Jelly, you have a question?
Oh, no, I think I had a comment from what you said about how you can turn off Google backup and cloud.
Oh, okay.
The images on your device, right?
Local.
I mean, my phone is going to fill up because I take a lot of Disney pictures. We're just talking about the idea of, when we're working with big data in the field of data science, getting rid of data, duplicate data,
Mm-hmm.
old data, because we have all of these icebergs, because that's what Amazon's iceberg thing is for you to put your old company's data there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you need to have some type of philosophy of, do we keep it 6 months, do we keep it 18 months? And in certain regulatory industries, you're going to have to keep it longer, but making sure that you're cleaning out those Amazon iceberg shells, because it's also costing you money.
Yep.
You're storing data storage costs a lot of money. So just being mindful of not keeping that redundant data quality at the end of the day needs to have some type of standard of practice around, but that's all I have to say.
No, I like that a lot. And I think touches on do we need to be collecting some of this data? Should companies be collecting some of this data? This gets into data privacy, not gonna touch on it, but it gets into us as the product, not the consumer. Do we need to keep track of every single interaction that happens on Facebook? Probably not, especially not nowadays. No, nobody goes on Facebook anymore, right? Cool. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll end here. I'll be around for today if people have questions, but I appreciate everyone coming to my talk.
Bye.